World Health Organization is sounding the alarm. Its latest report says some of the most powerful weapons we have in the fight against infectious disease are useless because of a growing global resistance to antibiotics. And if we don't act now, it means even minor infections could become major problems.
It's worrying because colistin is one of the last drugs of last resort that we use on ITU to treat common infections when everything else has failed.
If we got the right bug at the right time, then yeah, sure, we can have a new compound. Yep.
When Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin here in London in 1928, it changed the face of medicine. Antibiotics like penicillin have saved the lives of millions around the world, and modern healthcare is reliant on their use for surgery, cancer treatments, and to prevent the most simple of infections becoming fatal.
What's particularly worrying about this form is that it is a very transmissible sort of resistance, so it can spread to other bugs, it will spread quickly. It's already spread, we think, to Malaysia, and the chances that it will spread globally are very high.
I mean, the headlines are about we're on the precipice of the end of the antibiotics era, but how much of this is actually a human issue? How much is a treatment of animals issue?
It illustrates completely that although this is a global health threat, the response has to be a joined-up response with agriculture, with fisheries, with trade, with industry, and with national governments across the world.
Cass Rusi reports.
You survive a knee replacement, but bacteria sets in. Antibiotics, those life-saving drugs, help fight the infection, the stuff of what modern medicine is built on.
In terms of some of the key steps,
but in an ominous report, the World Health Organization warns that resistance to antibiotics has reached alarming levels, rendering many of the life-saving treatments useless against infections.
He says, quote, "For a long time, there have been newspaper stories and covers of magazines that talked about the end of antibiotics, question mark. Well, now I would say you can change the title to The End of Antibiotics, period. We're in the post-antibiotic era. There are patients for whom we have no therapy, and we are literally in a position of having a patient in a bed who has an infection, something that 5 years ago we could have treated, but now we can't."
So we have a virus with no treatment protocol and no vaccine at this time.
This was Hollywood's take on a global health crisis, but according to the World Health Organization, it might not be far off.
This is a scenario which could happen. Obviously, it hasn't happened yet, but we are seeing more and more cases of where it is getting close to happening.
About 2/3 of antibiotics are actually used in animals. And antibiotics, unlike other drugs, will develop resistance the more they're used. The more they are abused, the more quickly this will happen.
Have we already got to that point, though, haven't we? Clearly, in your terms, they are being abused, they're being used far too liberally, and the damage has been done. So either we find new antibiotics or we're doomed?
We have to work on all fronts. We do need industry to develop more antibiotics, to find new formulations and ways of working existing antibiotics.
But resistance to antibiotics is growing at an alarming rate, with projections that by 2050, drug-resistant infections could kill more than 10 million people a year worldwide.
when we are most vulnerable and in need of these medicines, there is a chance that they are simply not going to be available, and we are not going to be able to have access to effective medical care in a number of instances.
And MRSA only used to happen in healthcare facilities because there would be antibiotic-resistant bacteria. That's what MRSA is. It would evolve to that point because you're constantly fighting bacteria and things like that in hospitals. So that's the place where the evolution would happen if it were to happen, right? So it made sense for it to happen in hospitals. It doesn't really make sense for it to happen elsewhere, but now it is happening elsewhere. It's happening at gyms and at schools, and it's also a different kind of MRSA. They say that this MRSA shows presents itself as a rash on the skin as well. and it's incredibly painful. And so here's the part that made my jaw drop. I mean, this already made my jaw drop, but it dropped even further. Because such infections can't be treated with conventional antibiotic therapies, doctors have begun to, quote, reach back into the archives and use older antibiotics. We're using a lot of colistin, and we're using more of it every year. It's very toxic. We don't like to use it. It damages the kidneys, but we're forced to use it in a lot of instances.
The threat from the antibiotic-resistant superbug, they say, is global, serious and growing, heralding the dawn of a post-antibiotic era and the end of modern medicine as we know it.
The bacteria are rapidly becoming resistant to antibiotics, and we're running out of choices. I mean, I fully expect to see a lot of 100% resistant bacteria that I'm trying to treat during my career.
Yeah, so this is a nice...
In his lab at Toronto's Sunnybrook Hospital, Dr. Andrew Seymour studies one of the latest threats, a hospital-acquired infection called MRSA.
The mauve color are the bacteria.
While some countries have been aggressive in surveillance for antibiotic resistance, he says Canada lacks a national plan.
We can't rely on being in a protected environment here in Canada. We know that these organisms are circulating in other parts of the world, and sooner or later, if they're not already here, they will be here.
We need to get much better at controlling infection in both the human and the animal sector. 12 million tonnes of colistin are being used in, 12,000 tonnes in China each year, 800 tonnes in the US and 400 in Europe.
And how much do you think of that is being used as almost as a preventive measure rather than actually needed? I mean, it could be, I presume, issues of hygiene and things like that could go a long way to deal with the issues instead.
Absolutely, and not using antibiotics as growth promoters. I mean, they are put in animal feed to make animals grow faster, as well as as a substitute for poor care.
Director General Dr. Margaret Chan warned things as common as strep throat or a child's scratched knee could once again kill. Hip replacements, organ transplants, cancer chemotherapy would become far more difficult or even too dangerous to undertake. We cannot allow the loss of essential antimicrobials, essential cures for many millions of people, to become the next global crisis. It's a world Sue Fallon has something of an insight into. Her 17-year-old daughter Samantha was a fit and normally healthy A-level student until she was admitted to hospital with a virus. Within days, Mrs. Fallon was watching her daughter die after contracting MRSA.
She started fitting on the Monday, when they took the line out of her neck. She went to intensive care and they sedated her. And then she died on the Friday afternoon.
Antibiotics are effectively a selective poison. They target the bacteria in our bodies and leave the healthy cells alone. But as more of those bacteria become resistant, more antibiotics need to be found, and that's where the problem lies. The pipeline for new drugs is running virtually dry.
In its first global report on antibiotic resistance, the WHO uses unusually strong language in describing this clear and present danger, saying far from an apocalyptic fantasy, this is a very real possibility right now.